Welcome back to Proxy, everybody, and today we're going to be talking about how to play a Craftworld Eldar Aspect Army in 10th edition. Now this is kind of to wrap up my series on Aspect Warriors. I wanted to kind of show you guys that Aspect Warriors are still good. I know a lot of you out there are kind of, not happy with how GW changed them. A lot of them do less damage, and their roles are much more narrow. And that means oftentimes they are going to look worse on paper, but in practice, they're still very powerful. And a lot of us still love Aspect Warriors, right? I mean, I know personally they're one of my favorite parts of the army. When I first started playing Eldar, I was attracted to the Beal-Tan because of their Aspect Warriors. And for all you Beal-Tan lovers out there like me, you still want to be able to run your favorite aspects on the battlefield without them feeling terrible. Well, I have great news for you. They aren't terrible. In fact, they're a pretty good army, especially when they work in cohesion with each other. So without further ado, let us go ahead and jump right into it and talk about how to unleash the Swordwind. So first, let us go ahead and do a quick overview of today's video. We're going to be doing a general analysis of Aspect Warriors in 10th edition, how they have changed in general. If you do want to look at each specific Aspect Warrior, I've done separate videos on those. You can check out my channel page for those uploads. We're going to look at the strengths and weaknesses of Aspect armies, general tips and strategies when fielding and playing an Aspect-based army. And lastly, I'm going to give you guys an example of an Aspect-based list of my own that I've been running in 10th edition. So, in general, what do Aspect Warriors do in 10th edition? So, nearly all Aspect Warriors had their costs reduced and role narrowed or changed. So basically what happened is what GW did with a lot of the Aspect Warriors is they cut a lot of their bonus rules and they made them cheaper as a result so that their role is much more narrow than before. And this was with few exceptions. Shining Spears did get more expensive and they arguably got a lot worse. That is true. Crimson Hunters are basically just still bad and have less synergies than they did last edition. So they're still not great. Shining Spears took a big hit, but other than that, pretty much all other Aspect Warriors are cheaper, and their roles have been narrowed a bit. Which is not necessarily a bad thing, it just means that you need to use them more specifically for certain tasks on the battlefield, instead of using them as a catch-all unit. I know I, for one, was using Howling Banshees just basically to kill everything that entered the midboard, right? Any unit, regardless of its toughness, was usually, with buffs, able to be killed by a Howling Banshee squad. And I have to admit, at 110 points, Howling Banshees were basically included in every single Eldar army. They were just so good for the cost. So yes, Howling Banshees are much worse than last edition, but their role has narrowed, and they did get a little bit cheaper as a result. This also means that different aspects will rarely have overlapping roles, as was the case in 9th edition. For example, Warp Spiders and Dire Avengers in a non-Hail of Doom army in 9th edition basically did the same thing, which was eliminate heavy infantry. And that was it. They basically shared the same role. Warp Spiders were more expensive, but didn't need a transport, and Dire Avengers were less expensive, but probably needed a transport to get where they were going. And there was not much difference between the two. In 10th edition, that's no longer the case. Aspect Warriors have certain roles. They have specific roles on the battlefield that they are good at performing, and those roles rarely overlap. Aspect Warriors are also extremely efficient when performing the role they were designed for, and in my opinion, they are the best in game at this for their cost. So what are the strengths and weaknesses of Aspect armies? So the strengths of Aspect armies is that you're getting extremely cost-efficient units that are ultra specialized in their roles. You're getting units that are fast and play off each other's strengths extremely well. And you're getting an army that has fantastic secondary objective play. And I mean, honestly, the secondary objective play is top tier. They're fast, and when they're attacking their preferred targets, they're extremely points efficient, especially with combos and synergies. Their weaknesses, however, are that their units are fragile and have trouble scoring on primary objectives. This is normally something that you use Wraithguard or Wraithblades for nowadays. They're just extremely tough. But if you're running a more aspect-based list, unfortunately, you're not going to have much in the way of primary objective holders, because all your units are relatively fragile. And when I say relatively fragile, they are extremely fragile. they require a skilled hand to get the most out of them. And that could be seen as another weakness because if you are a newer player or, don't play as much, Aspect Warriors may be kind of harder to grasp in this edition than they were in last edition. In last edition, you could charge a unit of Howling Banshees into basically anything, and the Howling Banshees would perform great, even against vehicles sometimes because they had that +1 to wound. Everything in the game was less tough in general, so a unit like Howling Banshees on charge could actually do quite a bit of damage to a vehicle. And oftentimes you wouldn't feel bad making that trade because Banshees were only 110 points. Now you do have to use Banshees much more carefully because not only are they not going to be able to take out vehicles at all, but they're going to struggle against heavier infantry as well without buffs. So to use them effectively, you really need to know what they're good at taking out, and you need to maneuver them in such a way that they're able to threaten those targets specifically. So for those of you who are a little bit wary about using certain Aspect Warriors or using a full Aspect Warrior army in 10th edition, maybe you were a Bealtan fan or maybe you just really loved Aspect Warriors and don't know what the best ways to use them are, here are some general tips and strategies when fielding and playing an Aspect-based army. So the first thing you do have to do if you're running a lot of Aspect Warriors is you have to establish board control early to prevent your opponent's units from getting a foothold on objectives. And this is because your primary objective game is really bad. And it's always been bad, right? Eldar in general struggle with primaries if they're not using really tough units like Wraithguard and Wraithblades in 10th edition. Aspect Warriors just do not have the punching power to be able to deal with that. So in order to prevent this, you either need to get to those objectives first and deny certain areas of the board, or you need to use other supporting elements in your army to prevent your opponent from getting onto those objectives in the first place. So the Night Spinner is great at this, but also Dire Avengers are very good at basically denying ground to your enemy. And I will talk about them in a second, but if you want more details on that, you can always check out my Dire Avenger video. Use your mobility to your advantage to slip around your opponent and score on secondaries. Eldar are extremely good at this. They have extremely fast units like Warp Spiders and Swooping Hawks who have the mobility to basically get into your opponent's backline very quickly, even in the opponent's deployment zone, without really getting noticed or shot at. Both of those units have a very small footprint. Swooping Hawks and Warp Spiders both are on the smallest of bases. This might change when they get new models, that's true. But for now, they're on very small bases and they're very hard to see when behind obscuring terrain. So it's very easy to hide them throughout the battle, and you can use their mobility and their, small footprint to your advantage to score on those secondary objectives like behind enemy lines, deploy teleport homers, and much more. Even engage on all fronts if you're so inclined. Also, make sure you use your Aspect Warrior units together to perform coordinated strikes to create gaps in your opponent's line, which can be exploited. So if you notice your opponent has a transport with troops inside and a couple of supporting elements on a flank ready to take and hold down an objective, use your Aspect Warriors in concert with each other to take down that threat. Use your Fire Dragons to take out the transport. Yes, Fire Dragons with the right build can easily take down a transport. I had a couple people telling me that Fire Dragons were no good against vehicles anymore. Most transports are toughness 9 or less. And even if it's a heavy transport, if you're coming out of a Falcon, you have the Falcon to support you, and you also have Fuegan to support the Fire Dragons, you're easily going to be able to take down that Land Raider or that Heckinton Land Fortress, no problem. So don't worry about that. Fire Dragons can still take out those units with the right synergies. And if you don't believe me, Fuegan can take out a 12-wound vehicle by himself with a Fate Dice. All you need is a single Fate Dice, and he can kill it by himself. So I'm pretty sure between the rest of the Fire Dragons and the Falcon, dealing 4 more wounds to a Land Raider isn't going to be much of a problem. So yeah, even the tougher transports in the game will go down to that combo. To follow up with killing the vehicle, the units inside are now going to be battle shocked, so you don't have to worry as much about Overwatch. You can use units like Warp Spiders, Dire Avengers, and even Swooping Hawks to blow them away. All of those units are good at taking out infantry. And also at the same time, have the ability to slip around a flank and also score on objectives as well later in the game. So by ripping holes in your opponent's flank or a part of their army, you can ensure that the retaliation won't be as hard because they're not going to be in a position to shoot you as easily. My other piece of advice is be patient. You don't want to expose too many of your units too early in the game in order to Alpha Strike your opponent, because essentially in this edition, Alpha Strike is not as strong. We don't have a guarantee of Alpha Striking. We don't have Phantasm, so we can't move a bunch of Alpha Strike elements back into reserve if we don't get first turn. And if you expose too many of your units early, that's going to mean that most of your army is going to die. So you definitely don't want to do this. Yes, we do have Riel who can redeploy units, but you don't want to rely on that for an army strategy. And also, Overwatch hurts like a bitch this edition. So you do also have to be careful about that. If you don't have effective ways of dealing with it, if you put your whole army in front of your opponent's army turn one, and they have some Overwatch strategies, your army is going to be hurting pretty bad. And you might not have the tools necessary to compete in the middle and late game. Have a long-term game plan as well, and know which units need to be eliminated and which parts of the board you want to concentrate on. So Aspect Warriors are very good at picking off targets because they're so specialized. So have a plan for how to kill those units in what turns and be able to execute that plan. I know that's easier said than done, but there's certain things you can do to control the board and force your opponent's hand to where they will need to expose certain units to be able to try to get you off those objectives. And once those units are exposed, then at that point you can have a field day with your opponent's army. And lastly, use a wide variety of units with different roles and manage your resources wisely. You don't want to put all your eggs in one basket with an Aspect Warrior army. You don't want to have big units of 10, which are expensive, and yes, they will kill the enemy unit that they go after, but they're not going to trade efficiently, right? You want a lot of different units with a lot of different roles so that you can cover your bases everywhere. Because Aspect Warrior units are not Wraithguard, they're not going to be able to kill basically anything they come into contact with. They are going to be very specialized. So if you use a unit of 10 to kill your intended target, you might not have that many targets left that they can deal with effectively, and they might be in a bad position afterward. Especially with combat units. I would recommend that with combat units especially, you're extremely careful when using big units. Yeah, 10 Howling Banshees or 10 Striking Scorpions can easily take out a unit of 5 Marines. But what happens after that once you rip through them? Your opponent is going to shoot you to death because you may not be in a good position. So my answer to this is to stagger your units out into units of 5. I know squads of 10 can work with buffs and stuff, but you really do have to target bigger units if that's the case, right? You can't go after units of 5 Space Marines with a unit of 10 Striking Scorpions. It's just not cost efficient. Units of 10 need to go after units of 10 to make up their points. Or if they do go after smaller units, they have to make sure that they can use Phantasm to safety so that they can activate during the next turn and actually be useful to you in the later turns of the game. And at the end of the day, it all comes down to resource management, right? Having the right tools to deal with the right enemy units at the right point in the game, and also being able to bring about that confrontation so that you can come out on top. So the Eldar army, especially when you're using Aspect Warriors, is like a big machine, and every piece of the machine has to do its part so that the next piece can operate efficiently. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and share with you an aspect-based list that I've been running in 10th edition at 2,000 points, kind of give you guys my takes on it, and just run through the list and analyze each aspect of it in order to better understand what is required of an Aspect Warrior list to be effective. So without further ado, let us go ahead and jump right into the list. So this is going to be a 2,000 point army. I actually got this to exactly 2,000 points, which is funny because most lists now are at least 10 or maybe 5 points under. For my characters, I have a Zerman. His job is to go with the Dire Avengers, and they're going to establish board control early on in the game by dropping off on objectives and providing an 18-inch bubble of Overwatch in which enemies will struggle entering without taking a lot of damage. And what this does is it forces my opponent to move out to engage the Dire Avengers, which will open up other possibilities for my other Aspect Warriors in my army. An Autarch Wayleaper is also in the list, basically just for the command point, I have to admit. Right? You just basically take it for the command point. But with Fate's Messenger, an Autarch Wayleaper can mix it up pretty well. It can kill vehicles. It has a Dragon's Fusion gun, so that's pretty good. And in general, it's just going to be used for command points, but also just to hang out in the back and provide some support to units like Dark Reapers. I do also have Fuegan in the list. Fuegan is going to go with the Fire Dragons, and he's going to provide them with combat support, and he's just awesome by himself. He can take out a tank by himself. He's very strong. He exerts a lot of pressure on the enemy army because of his ability to revive and his strong combat presence, and he's just an absolute beast. And a very solid and competitive Phoenix Lord. As for my dedicated transports, I have 2 Wave Serpents. Like I said before, the 2 units of Dire Avengers will go in these Wave Serpents. The goal is to move these up the board into no man's land on turn 1, drop them off on objectives so they're getting that 4+ Overwatch, and then of course when enemy units enter that range, they can Overwatch at 4+ to hit, and basically for free because of Azurman's ability. And for those of you who don't know, Azurman gives his unit free Overwatch, and this is in addition to another Overwatch that you fired earlier in that turn. So essentially, you can get 2 Overwatches with both of your Dire Avenger units. The Wave Serpents themselves are really good at blocking charges, engaging enemy units, and tying stuff up. Very good at that. I gave them Bright Lances this time around because the army needs a little bit of extra anti-tank. So I figured I would take the Bright Lances instead of my normal Shuriken Cannons. But the Bright Lances are very good, right? They're re-rolling the hit roll with Unparalleled Mastery. They're twin linked, so they're re-rolling the wound roll. So they do good damage against vehicles. I have 2 units of Dark Reapers in my army, both minimum units of 5 with the Tempest Launcher. I think this is probably the best way to run them. You get 2 Tempest Launchers, which is really good at dealing with light infantry that may be out of line of sight. So things that the Dire Avengers can't deal with in the midboard, these guys can deal with as they come in. They're also very effective against heavy infantry, especially with plunging fire. And as the turns go on, I basically move these guys up ruin. So they start the game behind a ruin, hidden, so my opponent can't see them except with indirect fire weapons. And then as the game goes on, as my opponent's forces thin out, and as there's more threats my opponent has to deal with, the Dark Reapers start to creep up the ruin to get that plunging fire bonus and better line of sight on their units. They're also pretty cheap at 75 points a unit, and they're really not bad at holding objectives in your deployment zone. Right? So in an army like this, you're not typically going to have Guardians or any unit like that to hold objectives. So in a pinch, Dark Reapers can definitely do it. Not the best, obviously. Guardians are better at holding objectives, but these guys still are good for holding objectives because they do have that ability to have indirect fire, which allows them to still be useful even when in your deployment zone. As I said before, I do have 2 units of Dire Avengers, and basically the Exarch is armed with the dual Shuriken catapults. This is to ensure I have as much fire as possible when I'm overwatching in the midboard, and these guys are just basically there for board control purposes. And to force my opponent from their deployment zone so that the rest of my army can find gaps in their lines. I have 1 unit of Fire Dragons. They're going in a Falcon with Fuegan. They're basically my heavy anti-tank unit. They can basically deal with most heavy vehicles in the game. They have a little bit of trouble with things with a 4+ invul save, but outside of that, they're pretty damn strong. Howling Banshees are there to basically take out units that the Dire Avengers might not be able to see. Things that have, lone operative, for example, or some sort of lone operative ability. Or really just to tie something up that my Dire Avengers can't shoot. So yeah, the Howling Banshees might die, but they'll at least, trade evenly somewhat and then hold up an enemy unit for a key turn so that my Dire Avengers or other units can turn around and kill them. They're also in a Falcon. Shadow Spectres are also in the army. Shadow Spectres are just a great multi-purpose infantry killer that can deal with light or heavy infantry equally well. Their light infantry shots are very powerful, having the blast keyword and AP -1, something they didn't lose from last edition. And then, of course, they're also good at killing 3 wound models like Terminators. So that's a very good unit, kind of a versatile, well-rounded unit for dealing with enemy infantry. I do also have a unit of Shining Spears in the army. Now, the Shining Spears are probably not necessary in this list, as I found out. They're okay. I think what I've used them most for is just charging enemy transports that have disembarked their troops. So basically destroying an enemy transport with something else and then using these guys to clean up the contents of that transport. I have, however, ran into some issues charging into ruins. They can't really charge into ruins that easily, so that's an issue. So they're really only good at killing units in the open ground, and again, they're a little bit expensive for that. So I think if there was any weakness in this list, it would probably be them. I could probably exchange them for, more Shadow Specters or another unit of something else. I do have Striking Scorpions as well. They're there to provide infiltrate to the army. So this can deny enemy infiltrators and scouts, and basically ensures that at least one of the No Man's Land objectives can be occupied by my Dire Avengers in my first turn. That's extremely important because if you're not able to actually get on those objectives with the Dire Avengers, you lose the board control game early on. So not only that, but Striking Scorpions can also take out scouting elements of an enemy army very easily, allow you to get into better positions on the battlefield, and they can play some serious mind games with your opponent. Your opponent, knowing that you might get the first turn, may not exactly want to put all the scout snipers in range of those scorpions, so it is a good way of creating a buffer to your army. I also have 2 units of Warp Spiders. These guys are just great secondary objective scorers. They can get around the board edges very fast, and they're very hard hitting for their cost. Even at 100 points, by the way, they do serious damage. Have Torrent, have devastating wounds, what more can you say? Especially when these guys combine together on one flank, they can just absolutely devastate enemy infantry. The Swooping Hawks are there as a utility piece, basically just designed to get behind enemy lines. So, turn 2, maybe even turn 1, using Sky Leap, going back into reserve, and then on turn 2 or turn 3, coming in behind enemy lines, in your opponent's deployment zone, and scoring on things like behind enemy lines and deploy teleport homers. And also, if your opponent leaves a particularly weak unit in the backfield guarding objectives, Swooping Hawks do typically have the damage to take out those types of units. Things like Gretchen, things like mortar units. Imperial Guard mortars are pretty, weak to shooting. And cultists are typically pretty weak as well. So you can shoot at a unit of cultists with these guys and then follow up with the charge. You will need to use a fate dice of a 6 to make sure that on a 3+ you can get into combat. But if you're able to actually do this, Swooping Hawks can eliminate the rest. I think you'll only need to kill like 3 of them. The Swooping Hawk XR comes with a power weapon. So chances are you will be able to eliminate that unit and take the objective from your opponent. And yes, I have been able to pull this maneuver off several times on my opponent when they have weak elements in their backfield guarding objectives. I also have 2 Falcons in this list, and vehicles are a very important part of an Aspect Warrior army because they give your Aspect Warriors the threat range needed to perform their roles better, and they also give them protection. So one thing about an Aspect Warrior army is if you're going against an experienced opponent, he will take out your linchpin units first. So they will go after targets that they believe are key to your success and strategy in a game. So if they have a lot of tanks that they want to keep safe, they're going to go after your Fire Dragons. If they don't want to be tied up in close combat and, basically stalled until your shooting can obliterate the rest of their forces, then they're going to go after your Scorpions and Howling Banshees to ensure this doesn't happen. So Falcons, as well as Wave Serpents, allow your Aspect Warriors to survive until they can perform their given roles. And in this particular army, they have a secondary function. So a lot of people think Falcons are just attacks onto Fire Dragons or Howling Banshee units to make those units better. Yes, they do make those units better, but Falcons are also good on their own. They come with a Bright Lance, a Pulse Laser, and a, Shuriken Cannon. So they're pretty powerful at shooting as well. And even though they're not quite as durable as a Wave Serpent, they do have enough durability to survive most indirect fire attacks. And they're a really good gun platform. Now, they also allow Fire Dragons and Howling Banshees to deal with units that they would normally not be able to deal with. Giving rerolls to wound to Fire Dragons allows them to score a lot of wounds on heavier tanks, so Land Raiders, Hecatan Land Fortresses, things like that. A 5+ rerollable to wound is much better than a 5+ with rerolls 1 to wound, right? So they can boost the damage of their Aspect Warriors inside considerably, including Howling Banshees, by the way. You will get rerolls on their pistols and shooting attacks, as well as their close combat once they charge in. So with Howling Banshees, it's a very great combo because it allows them to actually take on heavy infantry pretty well. Lastly, of course, the Falcons boost the threat range of both Howling Banshees and Fire Dragons, With fire dragons, you can move 14, disembark 3 inches, and then fire their fusion guns. They're extremely short range, and they do better when they're within 6 inches, so that gives them a big boost. And with howling banshees, you can disembark 3 inches, which basically gives you 3 inches of extra movement. You can move 8 inches, you can advance, and then you can charge because howling banshees can advance and charge. So you can actually cover a lot more ground when they're in a falcon than they would if they're on foot. Okay, so final thoughts on the list. So I went with more of a fluffy army and tried to incorporate all of the aspect warriors in it. However, there are certain elements I could switch out to create a more effective army in the current state of the game. I think Shining Spears and Howling Banshees, while decent, aren't the best choices in general. I think Howling Banshees can be good, but, they do trade kind of inefficiently against a lot of heavier targets, particularly against anything with toughness 5. Even with the rerolls to wound, if your opponent has a good invul save, you're just not going to get a lot of damage through with Howling Banshees, especially just a unit of 5. So these could be swapped out for more Shadow Specters or other supporting elements like Shroud Runners or Vipers. I know that kind of breaks the all Aspect Warrior army thing, but Shroud Runners are great with a lot of Aspect Warriors. They synergize extremely well with both Shadow Specters and Dark Reapers. And they also give you a little bit of precision, so you can kill those 3 wound supporting characters in enemy units. And yeah, that's not a great chance of being able to kill a character, but they hit pretty decently. They hit on a 3+, they get a reroll to hit with their Unparalleled Mastery. They get a reroll to wound with that same Unparalleled Mastery. They can always give themselves lethal hits if they're close enough. And at best, most supporting characters will just have a 4+ invulnerable save and 3 wounds. So there's a decent chance you'll actually kill something with 3 wounds, like a Spirit Seer, for example. Yeah, your opponent could have a Phoenix Gem or could use a Fate Dice on it, but you're forcing your opponent to use those resources that they wouldn't normally have to use. So Shroud Runners are a very good supporting element for an Aspect Warrior army. Vipers are also very good because they can remove cover, and cover is something your opponent is going to have a lot of, and a lot of aspects besides Dark Reapers don't ignore cover innately, and actually the Tempest Launcher doesn't ignore cover itself. So to get more damage out of your army, you can definitely include a Viper in your list to remove cover from essential units that you need to kill. And of course, if you really wanted to, you could get rid of a Falcon, a unit of Howling Banshees, and perhaps even the Shining Spears and throw in a pair of Fire Prisms if you wanted to. I think they cost about the same points for all that switched out, and a pair of Fire Prisms will also give you a huge amount of extra anti-tank in your list. So if you have, a lot of matchups against Imperial Knights or Chaos Knights, Fire Prisms will be able to help you out in those situations and matchups. Alright, so in conclusion, despite the lack of enthusiasm for Aspect Warriors this edition, they really are quite strong. Most of them are extremely cost effective and play the secondary game very well. However, to unlock their true value, you do need to be careful with them and play to their strengths. Aspect Warriors are extremely specialized units who don't perform well outside of their intended roles. So using a squad of Howling Banshees to take on a vehicle is not going to end well for you, and the Banshees are just going to die, pure and simple. At the same time, you don't want to use a unit of Swooping Hawks to try to take out a heavy unit of Assault Terminators. That's probably not going to be the best use of your resources. So the question is, are Aspect Warriors and Aspect Warrior-based armies still good in 10th edition? Absolutely they are. You just need to keep those things in mind. You need to play to their strengths. And of course, make sure you have a plan going into the game. All right, everybody, that's going to be it for today's video. Thanks for watching. Thank you to all my Patreons and supporters who have supported the channel over the last months. We're basically at 2,000 subscribers, which is a great milestone to cross. So thank you once again for that. If you do want to become a Patreon member or support the channel further, I will leave the links in the description for you guys so that you can join our Discord community as well. Which, by the way, if you do become a Patreon member, free trial or not, you'll have permanent access to our Discord community, but you do have to sign up for at least a free trial. So do keep that in mind. Our Discord community is growing, and it's a place that you can talk about Eldar strategies, tactics, and hobbying with other enthusiastic players. And lastly, if you are interested, I do have a channel store page with a lot of different Eldar-inspired apparel. So if you are looking for something to rep your favorite faction in your local game store, go check it out. I'll leave the link in the description as well. All right, everybody, that's going to be it for today. peace out. Have some great games this week, and I'll see you guys next time. Peace out, everybody. See you later.